On May 31st, 1902, in a modest building in the small South African town of Vereeniging, Boer leaders sat across a table from British negotiators and signed a treaty that formally ended the Second Anglo Boer War. The Boer republics would be absorbed into the British Empire, their independence extinguished after nearly 3 years of brutal conflict. By every conventional measure, Britain had won. British flags now flew over Pretoria and Bloemfontein. British troops controlled every major town and railway line. The mighty empire had prevailed, as everyone had always assumed it would. Yet in the room where the treaty was signed, in the exhausted faces of both sides, in the staggering cost counted in pounds and lives, there was an unmistakable truth that no one could ignore. This victory had changed everything. Britain had entered South Africa as the world's unquestioned superpower. Confident that a few months of campaigning would settle affairs with some rebellious farmers, it emerged 2.5 years later victorious but deeply shaken, its military reputation tarnished, its moral authority questioned, its strategic assumptions shattered, and its understanding of what empire actually meant fundamentally transformed. The Boer War didn't just change South Africa, it changed Britain's empire forever, exposing vulnerabilities that would reshape British imperial policy, military doctrine, and national identity for the next half-century. To understand how profoundly the Boer War altered the British Empire, we must first grasp what that empire represented in 1899, and how completely the war violated every assumption on which imperial confidence rested. At the turn of the 20th century, Britain stood at the zenith of its global power. The empire controlled roughly 1/4 of the world's land surface and governed 1/4 of its population. British industry dominated global trade, the Royal Navy ruled the seas, and British capital financed development across continents. More than territorial extent or economic power, Britain possessed something intangible but immensely valuable: prestige. The belief held by both British and much of the world that British power was inevitable, that British administration was superior, and that resistance to British expansion was ultimately futile. This prestige rested substantially on military reputation. Throughout the 19th century, the British Army had fought dozens of colonial campaigns, from India to Africa to the far reaches of Asia, and had prevailed in virtually all of them. These victories were often achieved with small forces against numerically superior opponents, reinforcing the belief that British discipline, courage, and superior civilization would always overcome mere numbers. The setbacks that did occur, the First Anglo Boer War, defeat at Majuba in 1881, the death of Gordon at Khartoum in 1885, were aberrations that only made subsequent victories more celebrated. By 1899, an entire generation of British officers and politicians had been raised on stories of imperial triumph, and they approached the South African crisis with a confidence bordering on arrogance. The Second Anglo Boer War shattered this confidence in ways that reverberated far beyond the battlefields of South Africa. The conflict began in October 1899 with Boer invasions of British territory, the sieges of Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking, and a string of British defeats that culminated in Black Week 3, major reverses in a single week that sent shockwaves through London and called into question everything the empire thought it knew about military power. These early disasters forced Britain to confront an uncomfortable reality. The Boers were not poorly armed tribesmen, but citizen soldiers equipped with modern rifles, led by capable commanders, fighting on familiar terrain for their homes and independence. The tactical and operational lessons would take years to fully absorb, but the strategic lesson was immediate and devastating. Imperial wars could be hard, expensive, and deeply embarrassing. The first profound change the Boer War forced upon the empire was military. The war exposed British Army tactics, training, and doctrine as dangerously inadequate for 20th century warfare. The frontal assaults at Magersfontein, the confused night march at Stormbird, the helpless exposure at Colenso and Spion Kop, these disasters revealed an army still fighting with methods appropriate for the age of single-shot muskets against enemies armed with magazine rifles and modern artillery. British soldiers were brave, disciplined, and well-equipped, but they were being led by officers whose tactical imagination had not kept pace with weapons technology. The result was casualty rates that shocked the British public and forced a fundamental rethinking of how wars should be fought. The military reforms that followed the Boer War were comprehensive and far-reaching. The Elgin Commission, established to investigate the war's conduct, produced a devastating critique of British military organization and preparation. Its recommendations led to the creation of the Committee of Imperial Defence, the establishment of a general staff to coordinate military planning. Improvements in officer training that emphasized professionalism over social connections, and a complete overhaul of tactical doctrine that recognized the dominance of defensive firepower and the obsolescence of close order formations. Marksmanship training was revolutionized, with emphasis placed on individual weapon skills rather than volley fire. The importance of reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and understanding the enemy was emphasized in ways that previous generations of officers had neglected. Perhaps most significantly, the Boer War led directly to the Haldane reforms of 1906 to 1912, which reorganized the British Army into an expeditionary force designed for rapid deployment to continental warfare and a territorial force for home defense. These reforms meant that when Britain entered the First World War in 1914, it fielded what many historians consider the best trained and most professional army Britain had ever sent overseas. The British Expeditionary Force that fought at Mons in 1914 bore little resemblance to the army that had struggled in South Africa 15 years earlier. The connection between Boer War disasters and First World War preparedness was direct and acknowledged the Imperial lesson. Kipling spoke of had been learned, though at terrible cost, but the military changes, profound as they were, represented only one dimension of the Empire's transformation. The Boer War also fundamentally altered British understanding of imperial warfare's moral and political dimensions. The conflict forced Britain to adopt measures that contradicted the Empire's self-image as a civilizing force bringing order and justice to benighted regions. The concentration camps, the farm burnings, the scorched earth policy, these were not the actions of a benevolent empire, but of a military machine, willing to inflict suffering on civilian populations to achieve victory. The death of approximately 28,000 Boer civilians, mostly women and children, in the concentration camps became an international scandal that tarnished British moral authority for decades. The controversy over the concentration camps, driven largely by Emily Horbuse's courageous reporting and advocacy, created an unprecedented domestic debate about imperial methods. For the first time, substantial segments of British public opinion questioned not just the tactics, but the fundamental justice of an imperial war. The Little Englanders and anti-war activists, dismissed as unpatriotic cranks at the war's beginning, gained respectability as the costs mounted and the methods employed became known. This domestic opposition to imperial policy was something new in British politics, not the fringe radicalism that had always existed, but mainstream questioning of whether the empire's expansion justified the methods required to achieve it. The international reaction to the Boer War was equally damaging to British prestige. European powers that had long resented British dominance watched with satisfaction as the empire struggled against a small opponent. France, Germany, and Russia all sympathized publicly with the Boers. and this diplomatic isolation demonstrated Britain's vulnerability in a changing international system. The Kaiser's infamous telegram congratulating the Boers after the Jameson raid had been one early warning. The consistent European sympathy for the Boers throughout the war was a sustained demonstration that Britain could no longer assume diplomatic support or even neutrality when pursuing imperial objectives. This diplomatic isolation contributed directly to the abandonment of splendid isolation. Britain's traditional policy of avoiding permanent European alliances and the search for allies that led to the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 and the Entente Cordiale with France in 1904. The Boer War had demonstrated that Britain needed friends, that its global commitments were potentially unsustainable without allies to share the burden, and that the international system was becoming more competitive and dangerous. These alliances, forged partly in recognition of vulnerabilities exposed in South Africa, would determine the alliance structure of the First World War and shape European politics for decades. The economic cost of the Boer War was staggering and forced a reassessment of what the empire could afford. The war cost Britain over £200 million approximately, £25 billion in modern currency, an enormous sum that dwarfed the costs of previous colonial campaigns. This expenditure came at a time when Britain faced growing economic competition from Germany and the United States, and it contributed to questions about whether the empire was economically sustainable. The days when colonial wars paid for themselves through plunder, or when imperial expansion generated immediate economic returns, were clearly over. South Africa had taught that modern wars, even against small opponents, required industrial-scale mobilization that could strain even the world's richest economy. The manpower demands of the Boer War similarly forced Britain to confront limitations it had previously ignored. Over 400,000 troops were deployed to South Africa during the war, a number that dwarfed previous colonial campaigns and approached the scale of continental warfare. This massive mobilization revealed weaknesses in British recruiting, training, and logistics that had been masked by the smaller scale of earlier conflicts. The recruitment difficulties, the large number of volunteers found physically unfit for service, and the organizational chaos of managing such large forces all pointed to systemic problems that would require fundamental reforms. The war also accelerated the development of Dominion nationalism in ways that would profoundly affect the empire's future structure. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand all sent volunteer contingents to fight in South Africa, and these forces, over 30,000 men, combined fought with distinction and developed a strong sense of their own military capabilities. The experience of fighting as distinct national contingents rather than simply as imperial troops reinforced emerging national identities and contributed to the Dominion's growing sense that they were nations in their own right rather than colonial dependencies. The Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand troops who fought at places like Paardeberg and throughout the guerrilla war phase returned home with enhanced national pride and expectations of greater autonomy within the empire. This evolution toward what would become the British Commonwealth, an association of self-governing nations united by common allegiance, but increasingly independent in policy, was accelerated by the Boer War's demonstration that the old model of imperial control from London was no longer viable. The Dominions had contributed substantially to the war effort, and they expected recognition of their contributions through greater voice in imperial policy. The imperial conferences that formalized this new relationship in the early 20th century owed much to the precedent set by Dominion participation in South Africa. The war's impact on British public consciousness and national identity was equally profound and lasting. The jingoistic confidence that had characterized British imperialism in the late Victorian era gave way to a more anxious nationalism in the Edwardian period. The Mafeking celebrations that greeted the relief of Mafeking in 1900 represented, perhaps, the the last gasp of uncomplicated imperial enthusiasm. The grinding guerrilla phase of the war that followed, the concentration camp deaths, the enormous costs, and the moral controversies created a more complex and troubled relationship with empire. Britain had won, but the victory felt hollow, and the methods employed raised questions about what kind of nation Britain was becoming. This anxiety about national identity and imperial mission manifested in various ways. The physical fitness of the urban poor became a national concern after so many recruits were found unfit for military service, leading to social reforms aimed at improving public health. The education system was scrutinized and reformed with greater emphasis on preparing citizens for the challenges of modern empire. There was increased discussion of national efficiency and whether British institutions were adequate for the competitive 20th century world. The Boer War had revealed Britain's vulnerabilities, not just militarily, but socially, economically, and institutionally, and addressing these vulnerabilities became a national preoccupation. The war's impact on British military culture deserves particular attention because it illustrates how deeply the conflict penetrated institutional thinking. Officers who served in South Africa, men like Douglas Haig, John French, Edmund Allenby, and many others who would command in the First World War, carried lessons from the veldt into the trenches of France and Flanders. Some lessons were learned correctly: the importance of reconnaissance, the dominance of defensive firepower, the need for combined arms coordination. Others were learned imperfectly or forgotten under institutional pressure. The Boer War also fundamentally changed British thinking about counterinsurgency and imperial policing. The guerrilla phase of the war, when mobile Boer commandos raided British supply lines and avoided decisive battle, forced the development of new methods: the blockhouse system, mobile columns, intelligence networks, and the controversial concentration camps and farm burnings. These methods, refined in South Africa, became templates for subsequent British counterinsurgency operations. When Britain faced insurgencies in Ireland, Palestine, Malaya, Kenya, and elsewhere in the 20th century, the methods employed often traced directly to precedents set in South Africa. The ethical questions these methods raised would similarly recur, never fully resolved. The political settlement in South Africa itself demonstrated another lasting change in British imperial policy. The Treaty of Vereeniging was remarkably generous to the defeated Boers, promising eventual self-government and substantial reconstruction aid. This generosity was partly tactical. Britain needed reconciliation to make its South African position stable, but it also reflected a new understanding that the empire could not be held purely by force. The rapid granting of self-government to the Transvaal and Orange River Colony in 1906–1907, less than 5 years after the war's end, and the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910 with substantial Boer participation in government, represented a pragmatic acceptance that cooperation with former enemies was preferable to permanent occupation. This South African model warfare, followed by relatively generous peace terms and power sharing with former opponents, would influence British decolonization policy throughout the 20th century. The idea that empire could transition to association through negotiated settlements rather than being maintained by force or lost through violence was tested first in South Africa. The success of this approach, at least in the short term, encouraged similar attempts elsewhere, though with varying results. The paradox of the Boer War was that Britain's victory led directly to concessions that would have been unthinkable before the war, demonstrating that the cost of victory could force the winner to compromise as surely as defeat. The war's impact on British perceptions of race and civilization also deserves examination, though here the effects were complex and contradictory. On one hand, the Boers' effective resistance forced some British observers to acknowledge that white settler populations fighting for their homes were far more formidable opponents than they had anticipated, complicating simplistic racial hierarchies. On the other hand, the British use of African scouts, labourers, and in some cases, armed auxiliaries. Despite the theoretical agreement that the war would be a white man's war, demonstrated the impossibility of conducting imperial warfare without involving colonized populations. The suffering of Africans in concentration camps, over 14,000 deaths that received far less attention than the 28,000 Boer deaths, revealed the racial double standards inherent in imperial consciousness. The long-term consequences of the Boer War for African populations in South Africa were largely negative. The peace settlement between British and Boers essentially abandoned African political rights, setting the stage for the union of South Africa's discriminatory legislation and ultimately for apartheid. British imperial officials, exhausted by the war and desperate for reconciliation with the Boers, sacrificed African interests to achieve political stability among the white population. This betrayal would have consequences that extended through the 20th century, and it represented one of the war's most morally troubling legacies, that Britain's victory was built partly on denying the rights of the majority population. The financial and economic lessons of the Boer War influenced British imperial policy for decades. The realization that colonial wars could be enormously expensive led to greater caution about imperial expansion and to attempts to make colonies more economically self-sufficient. The principle that colonies should pay their own way, rather than requiring ongoing subsidies from London, became more firmly established. This in turn encouraged colonial development policies aimed at creating revenue-generating economies, often with problematic consequences for indigenous populations whose land and labour were exploited more systematically. The war also accelerated the development of modern propaganda and public relations as tools of imperial policy. The British government's efforts to control the narrative about the concentration camps, to manage international opinion, and to maintain domestic support for the war effort represented early attempts at what would now be called strategic communications. The lesson that managing public opinion was as important as winning battles was one that 20th century governments would apply repeatedly. The Boer War saw early use of modern media photography, mass circulation newspapers, telegraphed communications in ways that shaped how wars were reported and understood, setting precedents for future conflicts. The cultural impact of the Boer War on British society extended into literature, art, and popular culture in ways that reflected the conflict's ambiguous legacy. Writers like Arthur Conan Doyle, Rudyard Kipling, and John Buchan, who participated in or commented on the war, helped shape how it was remembered, often emphasizing lessons learned and imperial resilience rather than the moral controversies and strategic failures. Yet the war also produced a darker, more questioning literature that reflected unease about imperial methods and costs. The cultural conversation about the war contributed to the gradual erosion of unquestioning imperial confidence that characterized the late Victorian period. The institutional reforms triggered by the Boer War extended beyond the military to include civil administration, intelligence gathering, and colonial governance. The creation of the Committee of Imperial Defence in 1902, directly resulting from recognition that military and political strategy needed better coordination, became a crucial institution for managing Britain's global commitments. The improvements in intelligence gathering and analysis, driven by the recognition that poor intelligence had contributed to military failures in South Africa, laid foundations for more systematic intelligence work that would prove valuable in subsequent conflicts. The war's impact on British relations with the United States deserves attention as well. American sympathy for the Boers and criticism of British methods contributed to British recognition that American opinion mattered, and that the two English-speaking powers had common interests that transcended their rivalry. The The movement toward Anglo-American cooperation that accelerated in the early 20th century owed something to British realization during the Boer War, that isolation was dangerous and that potential allies should be cultivated. This rapprochement would prove crucial in both world wars and would shape the 20th century international order. When we assess how the Anglo Boer War changed Britain's empire forever, we must recognize that the changes operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Tactically, the war forced recognition that modern weapons had transformed warfare in ways that obsolete doctrine could not address. Strategically, it demonstrated that imperial wars could be expensive, difficult, and internationally controversial in ways that previous colonial campaigns had not been. Politically, it contributed to the evolution from empire to commonwealth by demonstrating that self-governing dominions were more sustainable than directly ruled colonies. Economically, it forced recognition that empire had costs that might exceed benefits and that imperial expansion had practical limits. Morally, it raised questions about imperial methods that would never be fully answered, and that would complicate Britain's moral authority throughout the 20th century. The paradox of the Boer War is that Britain's victory became a turning point toward imperial decline. The empire would continue to expand territorially in the decades after 1902, reaching its maximum extent after the First World War, but the confident, uncomplicated imperialism of the Victorian era was gone, replaced by a more anxious recognition of empire's costs and contradictions. The Boer War had demonstrated that even small opponents could inflict enormous costs, that modern wars required industrial-scale mobilization, that international opinion mattered, and that the methods required for imperial control could undermine the moral justifications for empire itself. The British Empire that emerged from the Boer War was in many ways more capable militarily than the one that had entered it. The reforms in training, doctrine, and organization made the British Army a more formidable force. But it was also a more vulnerable empire, psychologically and politically, aware of its limitations in ways that previous generations had not been. The confidence that empire was Britain's destiny and that resistance to British expansion was ultimately futile had been replaced by a more sober understanding that empire required constant effort, substantial resources, and controversial methods to maintain. The men who led Britain into the First World War had been shaped by the Boer War experience. They understood that modern conflicts would be costly and brutal, that civilian suffering would be enormous, and that victory would require total mobilization of national resources. When war came in 1914, Britain mobilized with a seriousness and comprehensiveness that owed much to lessons learned in South Africa. The British expeditionary force that deployed to France was professional, well-trained, and tactically competent in ways that the army of 1899 had not been. But the willingness to accept enormous casualties, the understanding that modern war meant suffering on unprecedented scale, the recognition that total war required controversial measures, these two were legacies of the Boer War experience. The Anglo Boer War changed Britain's empire forever, not through a single dramatic transformation, but through accumulated lessons that reshaped how Britain understood power, how it exercised imperial control, and how it conceptualized its place in the world. The war demonstrated that the 20th century would be different from the 19th, that the rules that had governed imperial expansion in the Victorian era no longer applied, and that Britain would need to adapt or face decline. Some of these lessons were learned and applied successfully. Others were learned imperfectly or ignored. But the fact that lessons needed to be learned at all represented a fundamental shift from the confident assumptions of 1899. The treaty signed at Vereeniging in May 1902 officially ended the war, but it could not end the questions the conflict had raised about empire's costs, methods, and sustainability. those questions would persist throughout Britain's 20th century experience, shaping decolonization debates, influencing how Britain fought subsequent colonial conflicts, and ultimately contributing to the recognition that empire as Britain had known it was no longer viable. The Boer War didn't cause the end of the British Empire. That process took another 60 years and resulted from many factors, but it began the psychological and political shift that made that end conceivable, even inevitable. The small South African republics that Britain fought with such difficulty at the turn of the 20th century could not defeat the empire militarily, but by forcing Britain to recognize the costs of modern imperial warfare, by demonstrating that small opponents could inflict enormous damage, by requiring methods that undermined imperial moral authority, and by exposing military and political vulnerabilities that Britain had previously ignored. The Boers and the war they fought changed the trajectory of British imperial history. The empire that emerged victorious from South Africa in 1902 was more capable in some ways, but more vulnerable in others, and it carried forward lessons about imperial limits, about the costs of control, about the gap between power and legitimacy that would shape its remaining decades. The Anglo Boer War changed Britain's empire forever, not by destroying it, but by beginning its transformation from confident expansion to defensive preservation to ultimate dissolution, a process that would define Britain's 20th century experience, and that began in the hills and trenches of South Africa, where imperial assumptions met modern reality and were found wanting.